presents Cosmic Consciousness with Ken Wilber. Do you think there's a difference in the way people will apprehend your work in listening to it than in reading it?
Almost certainly. And part of the difficulty, I think, is particularly in person, so much of what I tend to convey tends to be body language or tone or something like that. It'd probably be even better if people could, see a film or a video. Because in the written form, a whole lot of what I do doesn't come across very well, strangely enough, because what I've done is write so much. But particularly, I have a really warped sense of humor. I'm usually making jokes. I'm usually smiling when I'm talking about something. And if you simply transcribe that and read it, it can sound cold, it can sound mean, and so on. So a lot of people sometimes get upset if I'm being critical from the written word, and they almost hate me for that. Whereas if they see me in person, then they hate me for all the right reasons. They actually come to see the full me, and they're disgusted with that instead of just the written form. But yeah, I think people get an entirely different sense when they hear me and see me than they do on the written page.
Okay, so just in starting, Ken, for people who aren't that familiar with your work, are we meeting now a philosopher, a map maker, a theorist? What's the best word to use for the lens that you use for your work?
I've sort of really trained in none of those. It's more strange as it sounds. It's kind of a storytelling. And it's sort of one of the things that human beings do is, on the one hand, they live their lives. And on the other hand, they make maps about it. They tell stories about it. They represent it. They make theories about it. It can be complicated, less complicated, and so on. And obviously people wonder about it. They philosophize. Sometimes it's more intense and serious. And other times it's just sort of casual. But everybody sort of carries around their own philosophy of life, because you sort of, to be human is to kind of reflect on those things that are arising around you. And when you start to hook those together in a way that makes sense, then you're not just sort of coming up with random ideas, you're sort of telling stories. You're telling coherent stories. And really good philosophers are really, really good storytellers. And really good psychologists are really good storytellers. Sigmund Freud got one award in his life, and it was the Goethe Award for Literature, of all things. And you read Freud's early case histories, and they're like Sherlock Holmes. I mean, they're these extraordinary literary masterpieces. Now, a lot of his psychological theories haven't held up, but his storytelling was exquisite. And I think that's sort of, in a sense, what it is. So I'm telling a very, very complicated story in a certain sense, because it's trying to hook together a whole lot of various theories, ideas, facts, data, and so on. But it's still nothing but kind of a story that we can tell ourselves if we reflect on all of this.
Well, it's interesting that you start there, because as I began reading your work for this conversation, I thought this is either incredibly accurate or the best fiction, or both. Ken's a fiction writer, in a sense. I mean, as I was reading it,
I don't have any trouble with that.
Well, that you're sort of a self-proclaimed storyteller, in a sense.
In a sense, yeah. Yeah, and obviously part of the things you want to do is, when you get into it, there's sort of different types of stories. And obviously we do make a distinction between fiction stories and nonfiction stories. And the general distinction is that a nonfiction story is supposed to correspond to something real, vaguely, somewhere. Whereas fiction is supposedly you can make it up and it's not true, everything. But reality itself, I mean, Lily Tomlin said, "What's reality? Nothing but a collective hunch." And that's sort of true in a certain sense. So even the line between fiction and nonfiction can be pretty blurry every now and then. But the general idea, sure, is I try to tell a little bit more stories in a sense that have some nonfiction components to them. So they're kind of docudramas. In other words, there's a claim that we're representing some form of truth or reality that you can depend on. And so the stories I tell are more like this. Let's say we're looking at psychology or spirituality or sociology or any of the sort of various areas that we're talking about. And I will say something like, I'm going to tell you a story about psychological growth, and then you go check it out yourself and see if the story I'm telling you is true, what makes sense to you. So a large part of what I do is I take facts, data, evidence from all sorts of different sources, and I try to tell stories that are in some sense true. They represent something dependable. But it's always open to evidence and facts, and it can always be checked out. And probably, I sort of see it as kind of an ongoing docudrama on sort of the big picture of what does it all mean, how does it all fit together, what's the meaning of life, the universe, God, everything, all that kind of stuff. But those are big stories, and they ought not to be told as dry metaphysics. They ought to be told as really galloping good stories. If you really get into it, there's just nothing more interesting. And that's sort of what I try to do. And you try to tell it with a certain kind of, fizz and pizzazz. Philosophy is supposed to be really passionate. And I've never quite understood the academic philosophers that, get in races to see who can put more students to sleep quicker. I just don't think that's what it's about. I appreciate them doing it. I see why they do it. But I think it's a very limited kind of story that they're doing. So I think one of the reasons that some people are intimidated by some of the work I do, because it seems to be this terribly academic stuff. But a common experience that I hear anyway, when people get into even a very difficult book like Sex, Ecology, Spirituality, sort of 900-page monster, is that it's really fun. They really get into it and they really have a good time. Of course, these people are deranged or institutionalized, or they vitamin B deficiency, something like that. Many of them have a really good time. And that's mostly what I hope happens.
So as a storyteller of the big picture, what gets included in your picture and what gets left out? How do you make that decision? You're known as the map maker who has included everything, but obviously not everything. Some theories and some people's work you toss out. How do you make that decision?
Well, I actually try not to toss out anybody, but part of what you want to do with a map, and that's the first thing that's important to say, is really what I am doing is presenting a map. Everybody knows the map is not the territory. Nobody knows this better than I do. I do not confuse the map with the territory. I don't take the map that seriously. On the other hand, if you're trying to get across a certain territory, it helps to have a reliable map. And so that's one of the things you want to try to do, is you don't want to confuse them. But on the other hand, you don't want to have a crappy map. And a lot of people sort of going around, in a sense, with a philosophy of life that amounts to a pretty crappy map compared to what you could have if you sort of included more evidence and more information and so on in that map. So whenever you're doing any form of map making, obviously you're faced with just that decision, which is, okay, if I want a map of downtown Manhattan, what do I put on it? How much? The main buildings, okay, the main streets, okay. But as you start getting down into details, all of a sudden all sorts of stuff gets left out. And really, really good map makers know the level of abstraction to operate at. In other words, if you're trying to give a kind of a comprehensive map, it can't be so detailed that people look at it, and it just makes no sense at all. You've included so much stuff in it that it's not really helpful to use the map instead of reality, because the reality is probably not much more complex than the map, and you might as well just deal with the real territory. So you want to have some sort of map that's simple enough, but it can't be so simple it's just get you in trouble. If you look at the map, it just leaves out all sorts of important things, and then you really don't know your way around very well at all. And that's part of what I think is just the learning process of being a good map maker. And in the case, what I'm trying to do, in a sense, is make a map of human potential, human possibilities, all of the things that men and women can become, and all the things they have available to them in terms of their own growth, development, realization, capacities, activities, and so on. And so what I've done in really sort of a 30-year career is look at all the different maps from different cultures, look at all the different practices from different cultures, the various philosophies from different cultures, and kind of put all of them together, East and West, North and South, pre-modern, modern, postmodern, and said, okay, here's all of this sort of enormous number of potentials that human beings have reported over the last 10,000 years. Now, can we see any patterns here? If we put all this stuff on the table, is some sort of overall map start to suggest itself? And I believe that one does, and that's that generalized map, and we call it integral for sort of comprehensive. And that kind of integral map or integral approach is what I've tried to represent in these various books and so on. And there are lots of other people involved in these kinds of projects. I'm not the only one doing it. But the sort of integral map that I've come up with is one that a lot of people are comfortable with, in terms of it probably includes the most number of things from the most number of different sources. And so if you want to do something like look at an integral map, this is probably a good place to begin. And but it's an ongoing process.
Just to understand your map-making process, here you've got all of these different maps from history on the table from different disciplines. How did you decide, well, I'm going to pay attention to these and I'm going to put these over in the left pile and these over in the right pile and these I'm going to put under the table or in the trash can? Or how did that sorting process work for you?
There's sort of a general rule that I sort of summarize the integral approach with, and it's the phrase, everybody is right. Now, on the surface, it's kind of a platitude in a certain sense. I mean, it doesn't say very much, but I take it really seriously. And I for whatever reason, from when I was in my really late teens and early 20s when I started this, as you know, I sort of wrote my first book when I was 23, so I was deranged quite early. I mean, I was already a deeply confused young man who would want to sit around and actually do this kind of stuff. If I've had any guiding intuition over the years, it's just that. I don't believe any human mind is capable of producing 100% error. And that means that every single position that's ever been offered has some important piece of this puzzle. And so under those circumstances, you really want to go back and look at all of the major sciences, philosophies, religions, and so on, and say, okay, what important piece of truth are they offering? Now, obviously, that's it. Certainly when it starts, that can be a very subjective thing. Well, I like this, I don't like that. And all of a sudden, you don't really have a map of reality. You have a map of Ken Wilber's preferences. And that's exactly what you don't want. I mean, that's a nightmare. So what you do is you look for recurrent patterns. If you're looking at the world's religions, for example, and you find 5 or 6 or 7 things that most of the world's traditional religions agree on, then that's very interesting. All of a sudden, that's probably something that you really want to pay attention to. But at the same time, as you're developing a sort of overview or comprehensive map or model, you want to make sure that all of these different positions have room on that map. Now, it doesn't mean that they're going to have the whole truth, but it does mean that there has to be an important place at the table for all of them in that sense. And then ultimately what happens, even when you sort of done, compiling all this stuff, and it can get very complex and very confusing and all of that, it also shakes down in some very, very simple applications. Things like first, second, and third person pronouns, I, we, and it, turn out to be the good, the true, and the beautiful. That's art, morals, and science, those kinds of things. So all of a sudden you're starting to find a kind of coherence in the midst of this sort of chaotic jumble. And that's what good map making can do. But again, it's definitely a tricky process in terms of what you leave in, what you leave out. And you sort of get better at that as you go along. And you can also, you can make it more or less complex too. The model that I've worked with generally has 5 components. We call them quadrants, levels, lines, states, and types. And those represent a kind of summary of, if you take all these different potentials and all the possibilities and all the capacities evidenced in the world's philosophies, religions, various approaches to science, various human disciplines, modes of inquiry, all of these kinds of things. You put all of those on the table like we were talking about. And then you start to look for common patterns. Those 5 things, those 5 elements, tend to be 5 of the most important that you see recurring everywhere. So we sort of abstracted those and said that these quadrants, levels, lines, states, and types are the things that we want to use to develop our first sort of integral overview. And those really do shake down into very simple everyday human capacities, as I'm sure we'll see. And so even a very complex map like this ultimately has applications in the practice of law, or the practice of medicine, or education, or yoga, or psychotherapy, or doing art. And that's what's happened with kind of the integral approach, is that this overview map can be used to make any human activity fuller, more effective, more efficient, more interesting, because it's plugged into this larger picture.
It seems that often when you begin your storytelling process, you do begin with the I, we, and it lens. And can we just start there?
Sure.
Why is that a place where you naturally go? And can we really condense the most important pronouns or perspectives into these 3? Are there really no other ones we should consider?
Yeah, there are lots of other pronouns, and I'm in favor of all of them.
All pronouns.
Yes, I want to go on record as being in favor of all pronouns. I do not marginalize pronouns.
Okay,
this
good.
would be a very horrible thing. One of the things that happens is, you're doing this sort of cross-cultural sweep. You're kind of looking at all these different world philosophies, psychologies, spiritual systems, and you're looking for common patterns. So you can sort of say, these things appear to be really important. We should pay attention to them. One of the earliest common sort of classifying systems that you find, and a lot of people are familiar with it, is certainly you find it in Plato, for example, is the idea of the good, the true, and the beautiful. And that's really, if you think about those words, actually very interesting, because the good, the true, and the beautiful, I mean, they all sort of sound important, but if you kind of think into them, they're also a little bit different. And so the question is, why are these three different things? For example, why doesn't truth cover goodness and beauty? And the more you sort of start thinking about these three things, the more interesting it gets. And you find them in Eastern cultures, Western cultures. It's pretty common. And actually right up to, just to give a really technical example, Immanuel Kant, who many people think is the world's greatest philosopher, wrote 3 great critiques. And those were critiques about the good, the true, and the beautiful. So even down to very, very modern, sophisticated times, these 3 domains keep appearing everywhere. So all of a sudden you say, well, if I'm going to have some sort of comprehensive map, I might want to pay attention to these things. A common distinction is art, morals, and science. Art represents the beautiful, morals represents the good, and science represents true, objective truth. That's one way of looking at what these sort of 3 domains are. The good means morals, ethics, how we should treat each other as human beings. The beautiful has to do with aesthetics, self-expression, art, artistic expression. And truth can have many meanings, but it tends to mean something is sort of objectively true or not. So if I say it's raining outside, is that true or false? Well, you go to the window, you look, if it's raining, you say it's true, it's raining. But then that doesn't really tell us if rain is beautiful or not. That's a different question. I happen to think it's beautiful. Most people do. And then nor is that sort of, how should I morally act if somebody's out there getting wet and doesn't want to get wet? That's not answered by truth. That's morals. So all of a sudden you sort of find that these 3 domains in human life, and one has to do with sort of what's objectively true. One has to do with what's beautiful or self-expressive and so on. And that doesn't necessarily have to be true. I mean, what's true, what's beautiful for some people doesn't necessarily have, it's not something you can give a scientific test for. And then there's how we treat each other as sentient beings, human beings. What's the right thing to do? Those distinctions turn out to be important because different types of human inquiry are built around them. There's entire branches of human endeavor break down into these 3 categories. What's called validity claims, how you tell what's right in these areas, are all quite different. And they also play, obviously, a very important role in your own everyday life. Because really you're confronted by these kinds of questions and decisions all the time. And the way you can see it most easily is that it shows up in these pronouns. First, second, and third person pronouns. So, and there are many variations on first, second, and third person pronouns. We can talk about those, but a simplified form is I, we, and it. And let me just preface it by saying, technically, first person means the person who is speaking. So right now, I, that pronoun, would be I'm the one speaking. The second person is the person being spoken to, and that usually means you. So you is a classic second person pronoun. And third person means the person or thing being spoken about. So that's a he, a him, a her, or an it, or a they, or a them. If you and I are talking, that's first and second person, then there's an implicit understanding that you and I, to some degree, understand each other. So we're part of a we. And we actually use that term. We say we understand each other. We technically is first person plural, but we use it for second person also because you implies we. Now, after that thoroughly confusing statement, let me just then move into I, we, and it as examples of what we're going to use as first, second, and third person. I is art. It's self and self-expression. We is morals, how we treat each other. And it is objective truth. So I, we, and it boils down to variations on the good, the true, and the beautiful. Every time people use I and we and it, they're engaged in these kinds of domains. And they're making decisions about what I should do, what I shouldn't do, what's true, what isn't true, what's self-expressive, what isn't, what's beautiful, what isn't, and so on. What's desirable, what isn't, what do I desire, what do I want, what do I need. So one of the things that we try to do in just using I, we, and it is point out that any occasion can be looked at from those three different perspectives. And that's important because in the world where science dominates, for example, science tries to reduce everything to an it, an objective it. Science, real materialistic science, doesn't believe there's consciousness or beauty or art or morals in the world. There's nothing but objects, its, atoms, dust, dirt, rocks. That's it. And so scientific materialism, as we call it, is the reduction of all interior states of beauty and goodness, transcendence, spirit, and so on, to a world of its. Nothing but objective, flat its running around out there in the world. Obviously, that's probably not a good thing to do. And it's not to say that its aren't there, that objective truth isn't there. It is. But there's also the I and the we components. And those can't be reduced to it. And there's goodness and beauty and the sublime and transcendence and ecstasy and all of that. And that's just as real as its. If you believe that you have to include the good, the true, and the beautiful in a comprehensive map. Now, if you don't, then you're going to try to reduce one of those three to the other one. And incidentally, it's gone other ways as well. Subjective idealists try to reduce everything to I. And the postmodernists try to reduce everything to we. Everything is a social construction of the we. I think all three of those reductionisms are wrong because all three of them try to exclude these other domains. So that they're not following the rule, everybody's right. They're trying to carve out other people, and that's not nice. That's mean.
Let's just go back a couple steps here, because I know you don't want to marginalize any pronouns, and neither do I. Neither do I. So you somewhere got left out for me. We crossed. You became part of the we. And what happened to you?
The interesting question about you, second person. Right now, I'm talking to you. The question is whether you and I understand each other. Because if you and I don't understand each other at all, and it could be for any number of reasons. You could be in a coma.
You could be incomprehensible.
I'd be incomprehensible.
It's possible.
That's possible. If you and I are not part of a we, so that we understand each other when we say that, then you're really a third person to me. You might as well be an it or a him or her because we're not communicating at all. So even though you, it's very important that you is second person, and that is a distinct pronoun. And there's also second person plural. This first person singular is I. First person plural is we. Third person singular is him or her or it. And third person plural is they or them or its. Second person is interesting. Second person singular is you. But English doesn't have a good word for second person plural. So Southerners have to say y'all, you all, and Northerners say you guys. They're trying to somehow indicate, the second person plural. But what's really important in all of that is that if you and I understand each other, then I and you are part of a we. Is that part?
Yeah, and if we don't understand each other, I'm an it.
You might as well be an it or a him or her.
Okay.
There's no communication at all. So we don't want to ignore you. But you is important. I sometimes use second person as you/we. Because what's really implied in you is that there's an understanding. You and I are talking. Right now, I'm first person, and you're second person. And then when you talk, you're first person, and I'm second person. So we have two I's have become part of a we. And we actually use that. We say, do we understand each other? Yes, we understand each other. And so that's what's really important. That's the sort of crucial component, is whether the you is part of a we or not. And then it falls on the first person plural side or the third person object, alien, it side. And so that's why we kind of tend to talk about I, we, and it. You works fine. We can say I, you, and it, because the you implies this interpersonal domain. But we sometimes just shorten it to I, we, and it.
Okay, that's helpful. And then my other question here had to do with the validity claims and how they're different for the I, we, and it realms. So it's pretty obvious in the it realms. You can test it. It's raining. It's not raining. That makes sense. So what are the validity claims for the I and the we realms? How do I know if something's beautiful or not beautiful, or moral or not moral? Right.
Again, to kind of show how these simple distinctions that are in all natural languages, the I, we, and it, they show up in these sort of everyday interactions because we use those words all the time, but then they also show up in very complex philosophical arguments. We talked about Immanuel Kant, we've talked about Plato, the good, the true, and the beautiful. Probably the world's greatest living philosopher is a German gentleman named Jürgen Habermas. And Habermas actually has what he calls 3 validity claims. And these are very complex. You kind of look at them and you go, woof. I mean, this is tough. Well, any German whose last name begins with an H is going to be a bitch. I mean, it's you just Heidegger, Hegel, Husserl, Horkheimer, Habermas. There's some club over there that's some really horrifying Teutonic thing going on over there. Habermas is one of those, but he's also brilliant. And he's certainly my favorite orthodox, if I can say that, philosopher, conventional philosopher. And his validity claims, they sound kind of far out, but he calls them for truth, for truthfulness, and for justness or appropriateness. And those really are it, I, and we, those in the order that I gave them. So truth is, as you were saying, you just talked about, objective truth is what it's generally taken to mean. So we say it's true that it's raining, or is it true that hydrogen, weighs so many micro ounces? Is it true that water is 2 hydrogen atoms and 1 oxygen atom? All of that. That's fairly well understood. It usually means some objective event that you can go and actually check yourself. Truthfulness is interesting because it's the validity claim for the I domain. And what that really means is you and I right now are talking, and you're first person I, and I'm a first person I. Now, objective truth, we can both sort of, I say that table is over there, is that true? We can kind of look at that. But if you want to know the validity claim for what's going on inside my I have to tell you what's going on inside my I, and you have to decide whether I'm lying or not. So the truthfulness means how much you can count on me for me to tell you the truth about what's going on inside of me. It's also called sincerity or integrity. And that's what we try to judge when we interact with another I, don't we? You meet a person, and objectively, okay, they're 5'8" and they weigh this much and all that, and I'm fine. But I want to know, are they being truthful when we're in this conversation? Because that's the only way I can start to trust them. And that's the only way I can establish that when they report their inner territory, they're not lying. So truthfulness becomes the validity claim for that domain. And that's sort of what Habermas is saying. And it sort of jives. I mean, once you think about it, it sort of makes a certain kind of sense that that's the only way we have to get at each other's interiors is when I tell you what's going on. Then you have to interpret it. You have to decide whether I'm telling the truth or not. It gets a little bit more interesting because if you actually look at psychotherapy, what happens to people, we can take a Freudian view or Gestalt view or any sort of depth psychology view, is that there are parts of yourself that you're not truthful about. So because you're not being truthful about these parts of yourself, they're kind of shadow elements. You try to hide them. You try to deny them. You lie about them. That's the validity claim. You're not being truthful with yourself this time. And when you're untruthful about parts of yourself, those parts show up as symptoms, as neurosis, as pain, as anxiety, as depression. You violated that validity claim. You're not being truthful about your own heart and soul and mind. So it's not just some abstract philosophical thing. It's how we lie to ourselves all the time because we're violating that validity claim. Does that make sense?
A person in their most beautiful sense is being completely truthful?
No, truthfulness. Now, beauty is, we'll get to that. And that's a sort of a subset of this. And beauty is a part of the broader domain of aesthetics, what's aesthetically pleasing. And so that really also relates to self and self-expression. And that relates to truthfulness. So beauty can have, many kind of different meanings, very technical meanings. And so we have to be a little bit careful about that, and because that can vary a little bit. But what underlies the notion of aesthetics, when it relies on the self, is how you are self-expressing yourself sincerely or authentically or with integrity. And so great artists have a self-expressive truth capacity. They can express and convey these aesthetic realms with great force. And that's again part of that I-ness, whether they're expressing the self with a certain power, richness, authenticity, and so on. Beauty is a kind of a subset of that, and it falls into the general realm of it. And beauty is a kind of a little bit slippery. That can change from culture to culture as well. But the basic I is there in all cultures, it's in all major languages, and the whole notion of truthfulness about the I is really important. And it's really important in pathology, because it's the easiest way to explain what happens with psychopathology or with neurosis. You're not telling the truth about yourself. You're not being truthful. So you have to hire somebody to hold your hand and walk you through your own interiors, and so you don't lie about them. And that's really what happens with psychotherapy.
Okay, and then the validity claim for the realm of morality?
For ethics,
for the we.
Is justness, appropriateness. This is Habermas's term for that. And all it's really talking about is, in any society of human beings, we have various rules for how we treat each other, and that's ethics and morals. And that can't be reduced to just what is, or truth. Like we say, if it's raining outside, I say that's true, but that doesn't tell me what I should do about it. So there is a distinction between what is and what should be done. And that's the difference between it and how we treat we. And that can't really be derived from just the I either, because the whole point about a we is that there's more than one I. And that gets very, very complicated. I mean, a we/you is the great mystery. It's much more mysterious than an I or an it, because those are sort of lying around on their own, But when you and I say we understand each other, that's astonishing. Truly astonishing. That's the mother of all miracles. And they're all you sort of get into the whole discussion about why that could happen. And
when does it happen? How do you know?
And when,
yeah.
And when does it happen? And mostly it doesn't happen. But it's astonishing when every now and then people say, I know what you mean, I understand you. And there's a meeting of minds. And a lot of really great philosophers believe that the reason that can happen is that ultimately there's one self, capital S. And that's why we can resonate with each other and actually feel that there's a connection, which would be very hard to do if we were just kind of running around as separate little lumps of stuff bumping into each other. That's another part of the story. So we started with very complex good, the true, and the beautiful, and all of that, and really saw that these things are embedded in everyday language as I, we, and it. And every time you're using those terms, or any of those others, he, them, they, etc., you're really engaging these different dimensions of human existence. And so what we try to say with an integral approach is that however you want to get into the fine details about this, don't try to reduce the good or the beautiful to the true, or don't try to reduce I and we to it, or vice versa. In other words, everybody's right. All of these domains are very real and very important. So if you're going to come up with a comprehensive map, the suggestion is one of the first things you do is have the good, the true, and the beautiful allowed, or I, we, and it, or first, second, and third person pronouns, or these different validity claims that Habermas has used. So anytime we go into a situation and we're looking at human potential or yoga or education or politics, if you're using an integral approach, you'll say, what does the situation look like from an I perspective? What does it look like from a we perspective? And what does it look like from an it perspective? So that's sort of one of the ways that we'll start to try to flesh out any approach to make sure we're not leaving out these other dimensions. Because too many people have felt there's a great deal of validity to all three of these dimensions, and therefore part of an integral approach is let's include that. Until somebody gives us really, really convincing evidence not to do it, which nobody really has done.
Now from these three pronouns, you expand to the four quadrants. Why did we have to go from 3 to 4? I mean, I'm with you with 3. Why did we need 4?
Why to go to 4? Because we charge by the quadrants.
Oh, is that where it goes?
So this is our first move on the way to a 12-quadrant model, which sort of renders the word quadrant, not too helpful, and that means 4. If you look at the it domain, the third person, like the others, also has a singular and a plural form. And so there's he, she, it, they, them, its, plural. And even though both of those are sort of objective things out there, there's a whole lot of work done on why systems or holistic gatherings of its can't be reduced to singular it. And so a kind of systems theory approach, so to speak, reminds us that collectives, groups, systems of its operate a little bit differently than individual its. And it's really a parallel between I and we, for example. I is singular and we is plural. And there's a very close parallel between an it and an its, a system of its. So we tend to use that. The 4 quadrants are just a reminder that probably all 4 of those are what we ought to include, and not just 3. Although we all often talk about, the big 3, and because those kind of cover the essentials. But you get a little extra definition on your map if you use its. Now, again, we could include she and they and them. We could have literally, they're subjective and objective pronouns. First person subjective is I, objective is me. Plural is we, objective is us. So, so we were talking earlier about what you want on a map is just how much stuff to make it useful, but not too much to make it clunky. So after sort of looking at all of these things and how they appear in different cultures and what philosophers and scientists have made out of them, we settle on 3 or 4. And the 3 are I, we, and it, and the 4 are I, we, it, and its. And if we do that, then we sort of draw a little thing we call the 4 quadrant map. And in one of the squares in the upper left is I, and the objective form of that is an it, the outside, inside and outside. And then in the lower left is we, and the lower right is its, plural. So I, we, it, and its. And that sort of just gives us a little bit more granularity in what to discuss. It's important because there's a huge, and has been for centuries, East and West, huge arguments about the relation of a single object and systems of objects. And it's a whole argument between systems theory and empiricism and all these boring philosophical debates, but ones that we figure we have to cover, so we throw that in.
Now, what is the basic argument you're pointing to here?
The tendency, particularly for male, adolescent, analytic minds, is sort of to divide everything down into smallest units. And so when you get into the problems with reductionism, which means somebody wants to take their favorite quadrant or their favorite approach and say it's the only real approach, and everybody else is fundamentally deluded. And one of the first things that happens, particularly because science itself is so powerful, science dealing with the its and objective truth, is so powerful that the first thing science does, usually does sort of 2 things, but the first is it gets rid of I and we. So it claims that there really are no interior domains that can't be reduced to objects and its. So morals, art, beauty, all that stuff gets trashed very quickly, and you get scientific materialism, a sort of flatland world that basically is nothing but frisky dirt, if you look at it, sort of their view of what's real. It's a very compelling vision because objective truth is relatively easy to get at. It holds still. Rocks don't jump around. You don't have to interpret rocks. They're good enough to not sort of talk back. And so most science deals with those things that you don't have to get into a discussion with. So it looks at anything objectively, ecosystems, trees, rocks, mountains, planets, stars, big bangs, all that kind of stuff can be dealt with because they're all its, and they're all explained in it language. There's not an I or a we in a lot of that stuff. So it's easier to do on the one hand, but for just that reason, it's extremely powerful and effective. It can indeed plop a person on the moon. So the first thing science does, and you have to be real careful about, is it doesn't just say, I will investigate an it. It says, I and we don't exist. All those interiors don't exist. They're just fantasy, illusions, get rid of them. And all those interior things include things like God and spirit and creativity and love and compassion and art and morals and all those things can all be reduced to atoms scurrying through neuronal synapses and explained in terms of serotonin and dopamine and all that. We're not saying serotonin and dopamine and all of that doesn't exist. We're saying it can't explain those other domains. So you have, again, this is what an integral approach says, no, you can't reduce art and morals to science. Those are the big 3, and you have to keep them, you have to honor all of those. But once science gets rid of art and morals, it then takes its second, and that's sort of gross kind of reductionism. It then looks even at complex systems like ecosystems. And it tries to break, an ecosystem is still an object. It's still out there. It's part of the it, objective it domain. And it tries to deny that systems exist and say that only particulars exist, so only atoms exist. And that's the ultimate sort of scientific reductionism. And so that approach is denying that even systems of its, holistic processes, exist, and there's nothing but atomistic little separate things clunking around on their own. It's the ultimate reductionistic move, and it's still the official sanctioned philosophy of most science. And so you find, even the great scientists today want to reduce all of sociology and psychology and all that down to sort of the selfish gene and Darwinian selection, sociobiology, and then they want to reduce that all the way down to nothing but the interaction of atoms according to the laws of physics.
Now, this phrase "flatland" that you use, is this your own word for this, or is this from some other source? There's no interior animation, so it's flat. Is that why?
Yeah, it was a semi-famous book brought out several decades ago. Actually, it became a little bit of a cult classic. And it was just called Flatland, and it was about. It was actually a mathematical treatise that was attempting to explain certain aspects of mathematics, and actually very cleverly. So if you take a sphere, for example, and you have a sheet of paper, and if you were living on the sheet of paper and the sphere passed through you, all you'd see is circles, because that's what a sphere looks like on a flatland. So it was a whole treatise about how flatlanders couldn't actually see these other dimensions, because when they passed through their little flat world, all they could see is little parts of it. And everybody immediately resonated with that, even though it was about mathematics, because it sort of explained what so often happens when you have one approach, no matter how useful it is, that's narrow. And so whatever comes their way, they look at it through the same narrow lens, and they see the same sort of flatland stuff. Abraham Maslow said if the only tool you have is a hammer, everything starts to look like a nail. And that's the same kind of approach. So I just sort of borrowed the term flatland to mean a little bit more specific, which is taking any of these great interior domains of the I and the we in subconscious, self-conscious, superconscious, pre-personal, personal, transpersonal domains, spiritual domains, all of those things get reduced to flatland objects, ultimately atoms. It's just a preposterous notion, but it's very, very prevalent. So we include plural, to represent the great systems theorists that are still scientists. They still believe in nothing but objective things, but they point out that processes, collective systems are just as important as individual it. And most of the really important sort of like ecology and so on really can't be explained by reference to just an organism or just a molecule. You really have to look at systems of interaction. Now, they leave out the interiors too, but at least they don't reduce it all to nothing but atoms. And the whole point about this is that all of those are correct. I mean, you want to bring all of those to the table.
I know when I've tried to explain to people just a little bit about your work, I always start with the four quadrants.
With that, yeah.
And it seems like that's actually quite a lot for people to get their mind around. And before we even get into levels and lines and
more mind-damaging things.
So just sticking for a moment with the four quadrants, can you give some examples of why it's useful to understand these four quadrants in terms of just going about your life?
Sure. If you want to be a writer and write about a philosophy, you can use it there and make money. No.
Okay.
People go to a spiritual teacher, and they obviously want to, in some sense, improve themselves, awaken, enlighten, have more awareness. One of the things that you sort of look at is, in other words for I, we, and it could just be I, we, and world, for that matter. And if what they're doing in this endeavor is just emphasizing the I dimension, then sooner or later they're probably going to start to find an imbalance in the we and the it. So if all you're kind of doing is just sort of processing your own consciousness and your own awareness, you might find that your interpersonal relations are suffering because you're not giving enough attention to those. You might find the spiritual approach doesn't actually deal with how do you actually deal with the objective facts of life. What do you do about the job, the car, the rent, and so on? And how does it deal with interpersonal relationships? What are you really doing when you meditate? Are you really increasing your sensitivity and compassion for others? Are you getting more self-withdrawn? So even on something like that, you can kind of do a little bit of a check and see, okay, what actually is going on here in terms of what domains are being involved, which ones are important, which ones aren't. A lot of people in the world of business, for example, are used to looking at the running a business, and they're used to following the it domain or its very carefully. So they want to know the balance sheet, they want to know what salary is, they want to know workers' hours, and there's a whole system of business management, total quality management, based on making the its have a lot of quality. But the problem is there's I and we involved in the business, and a lot of people aren't very good at the interpersonal we, and so their business falls apart because they're not giving attention to that domain. A lot of recent business practices have dealt with looking at the I. Emotional intelligence, for example, isn't about whether you're spit polishing your product, but do you have emotional intelligence when you're interacting with the world? That's looking at the I domain. Those are just sort of those kinds of examples. What you want to do is sort of check in with all these dimensions in yourself to make sure that you're not shortchanging them, because the idea is that those dimensions are there anyway, and they're acting anyway. So if you're not giving attention to them, they're going to start sabotaging you. They're going to be acting anyway, but you're not taking them into account. So again, you have a map, you're trying to fly over the Rocky Mountains with a map that's not very comprehensive, and you're very likely to crash. You're just going to not really know your way around very well. So one of the things that we do is, by introducing I, we, and it first, is then whenever we go on to any other component, you mentioned levels and lines, states of consciousness, and all of that, the reminder is each of these things can be looked at from an I, we, or it perspective. And so it's just a little reminder that even if you're getting into sort of things that look like they're merely interior, they really have repercussions in the external world. And you really need to take all of that into account. We use a 4-quadrant map, and we'll go into something like business, if there's business consulting problems. And almost immediately, people can learn to say, okay, we thought the problem was in this one quadrant, having to do with its, but the quadrant's really we. It's this other quadrant, because there's an internal culture clash of values between these different groups of people, and that's where our real problem is. We thought it was the assembly line. It's not. It's the we value. And so there's actually dozens of business consulting firms that now use that simple overview, because people immediately get that there are these different dimensions, and that problems in any one of them can impact all of them. And so those kinds of things. It's a brief reminder, but it can turn out to be really, really important.
Well, we're going to talk more about all
that
quadrant as we go along, but let's move on to the levels.
Let me make a different suggestion about how to do this, and I'll tell you why. When I was sort of coming up with the map, kind of working on it myself, I would tend to arrange these categories. We briefly mentioned them: quadrants, levels, lines, states, and types. And I sort of arranged them in what you might call size. So it's like quadrants looked bigger, and then levels, and then lines. And it was just sort of a random kind of way of doing it. And when a lot of people started applying this actually in the real world, particularly with businesses or education or psychotherapy, they said, that's really not a good order to introduce them. And they started telling me why and showing me what they were doing. It was much better than what I was doing. So they introduced quadrants first, because everybody sort of gets the I, we, and it fairly quickly. And they see that we have to honor all of those. They're all important. Don't go trying to throw them out. They then go to lines, what we call developmental lines. And the reason they do that is that those are also fairly intuitively understandable. People relate to those fairly quickly. And I'll just run through those briefly and show why. And then they go...
Let's keep it easy, Ken. You know I love that. So let's go to lines, baby. I trust you.
Howard Gardner is fairly well known for what he calls multiple intelligences. And he's just reflecting one of these factors that we can find cross-culturally around the world for thousands of years, the idea that human beings have different capacities, functions, talents, and so on. So you can have a musical talent, a mathematical talent, kinesthetic, which means bodily capacity, sports, for example, linguistics, and so on. These different capacities that human beings have are sometimes called modules, sometimes called intelligences. So you have a cognitive intelligence, emotional intelligence. You can think of a spiritual intelligence, a sports intelligence, a musical intelligence, a mathematical intelligence. We have a lot of evidence that those things exist, and they're very different. In other words, you can be highly, highly developed, let's say, in mathematics, and really not very good at emotional intelligence. As a matter of fact, it happens all the time. And it's often the case that if you have a kind of talent in one of these modules or lines or whatever they can be called, because you have a talent there, you kind of tend to go through life playing your strong suit. And these other modules or intelligences maybe are not very well developed. So they kind of atrophy a little bit, or, and whatever talent you might have had in them, you don't have any at all. Those modules or intelligences turn out to be important for all sorts of different reasons. Not the least of which is in educational system, we've learned, for example, we used to sort of education meant sort of cognitive development. So sort of, polish the IQ, learn the verbal stuff, and sort of get on down the road. And now we know that a lot of people really shine in other modules and other capacities. And somebody can be really great in music, or really great in kinesthetics, or really great in sort of interpersonal styles, and not very good necessarily in book learning or kind of IQ, cognitive sort of style. So when Howard Gardner took a lot of research that was sort of out there and well understood and kind of brought it all together in this concept of multiple intelligences. It really had a very positive impact on education across the country and really around the world, because it sort of gave people a way to formally acknowledge what they really knew was happening anyway, which is people can really shine in these various areas and not necessarily just in one. So that's very useful. It's also very useful just in everyday life, because you can sort of look at these different intelligences that you have, and you can say, okay, I really want to succeed more than I am in some ways. And maybe I'm in business, or maybe I'm a physician, or maybe I'm a waitress, or maybe I'm a lawyer, or whatnot. And I seem to just, be having trouble sort of succeeding. You can actually look and say, okay, my strengths in this intelligence are here, and over here, not so much. And maybe I need to actually start practicing or working on some of these other capacities that I have and that are undeveloped. It particularly comes into play in spiritual practice, because a lot of spiritual practices or lineages or traditions specialize in one kind of intelligence and not too good in other kinds. And so all of a sudden you find that you're really making progress in one area. You can meditate, you can concentrate, and you're doing really, really well, but you're not doing well in all sorts of other modules. And unfortunately what tends to happen is the teacher will often say, well, double your efforts. You're not trying hard enough. And so you really crank up, more attention to this one narrow area. What you really need is to be practicing some other practice that would help with this other type of intelligence that you're not doing very well with. We find it a lot in businesses. There are a lot of CEOs or leaders that, frankly, often are very good cognitively. They're very, very brilliant. But their interpersonal emotional intelligence sucks. I mean, they're really just nightmarish. And so they have a turnover rate that's just horrifying. But you can't tell them anything because they're so smart. So you have to actually go in with sort of armed with the research and say, look, you're doing fine, the cognitive intelligence, but in the emotional intelligence, you're just a dork. Trust us. We have research showing you are a dork. And they're kind of okay. They kind of look at it and sort of do that.
Now, just ask a question about the numbers of lines and the categorization of these lines. How many are there, and how do we know?
Like almost all maps, much of this is kind of conventional. You sort of look at it and you can divide up what you're seeing in any number of ways. It's almost like Fahrenheit and centigrade. You can say centigrade, there's 100 degrees, and Fahrenheit 212 degrees. Which is right? Well, they're both right as long as we know what we're talking about. But they're conventional ways to break it up. The same is true with levels and lines and states and types. A lot of it's conventional. It's just ways that we agree are useful to break them up. It's very hard to just really break these things into completely separate events. So even emotional intelligence, for example, depends to some degree on cognitive capacity. So they're all kind of interrelated. But you can also start to see certain of them kind of stand out and can be easily recognized and to some degrees exercised independently. We think there's about 24 of those. And they can include things from interpersonal capacity, psychosexual development, linguistic development, mathematical, musical. There are things like types of defense mechanisms, object relations, artistic capacity. These all tend to be relatively independent, not totally, relatively independent human capacities.
A defense mechanism is a line of development?
Yeah, yes, because what happens is another line of development is ego development, which really means self-development. It's not using ego in a bad way. It's using a very healthy way. And because the self develops, wherever there's a self, there's a boundary. A healthy self has a boundary. It's like an immune system. And sometimes, though, the immune system can get out of whack. And that happens when the self starts lying to itself, like we were talking about. And then you get a pathology, neurosis kind of thing. And since there's a developmental scale for the self, if something goes wrong at any of those stages, you get a defense. So there's a line of defenses and how they develop. There's a whole sort of unfolding hierarchy, if you will, of types of defense mechanisms that are used at these various stages of development. Fairly well researched, actually.
Okay, so these 24 lines, I've counted about 12 or 15 from what you've been talking about.
Which I think is enough.
Is enough to make the point. I mean, I always wonder things like, culinary skills.
I think culinary skills, if it's not a line, it should be.
It should be done. Yes, it's very critical.
So let's add that. Okay. So great chefs of that. But that is a kind of skill, and it is a kind of kinesthetic and creative skill. So it's almost a line. I mean, it sort of draws on one or two really distinctive skills, and those can be highly or poorly developed in people. here are a couple of ones that seem to be especially important. And we talked about the ones that Howard Gardner emphasizes, and they're important too, like mathematics and music and so on. There are a couple psychological lines that seem to assume a whole lot of importance for various reasons. One of them is in an individual, the line of moral development. And moral refers to we as well, but each individual carries this within themselves. And we'll talk about sort of that developmental line, or the what happens in that line. One is the needs, and Abe Maslow investigated these sort of levels of needs. He called them a hierarchy of needs, and they went from physiological to kind of self-protective safety needs, to belongingness needs, to self-esteem needs, to self-actualization, to self-transcendence. In the morals line, famously investigated by Lawrence Kohlberg, also Carol Gilligan. Carol Gilligan found that female moral development moved through three very broad stages, which she called selfish, care, and universal care. Incidentally, notice I'm talking levels. That's why you introduce lines first. People understand that you can be more or less developed in these different areas, and that means levels. So all of a sudden, people are comfortable with levels. We didn't start with that first, and then get very uncomfortable. So we'll just finish with lines and then come back to these stages that they found in these lines. So we have the morals line of development, or intelligence, and we have the needs line. Jane Lovinger, in probably one of the really pioneering and still most brilliant psychological research, looked at the line of self-development or ego development. And she found about 8 stages that people tend to go through in developing their sense of ego. And that's a very important line. And another extremely important line is a values line. And this is the morals line is an answer to the question, what should I do? If you ask people that, what should I do? And then analyze their responses, that's what you find. The needs line is, what do I need? What do I desire? What do I want? The self line is, who am I? Who do I identify with? How do I describe myself? And the values line is, what do I think is important? What do I think is really valuable? And a researcher named Claire Graves, also very, very brilliant researcher and an absolute pioneer, found that if you ask people that and really consistently study their responses, you find about 8 stages or levels or waves of development that they go through in their own values development. And that particular line has been popularized in an approach called spiral dynamics. It's just one of these 24 developmental lines, but it's an important line, and it's easy to understand. So those are some of the types of modules, intelligences, capacities that human beings have. And if you actually sit down and look at them carefully, you find that like almost any organic entity, acorn, chicken, it grows and develops through a series of stages, from sort of birth to maturity, if you will. And so the next thing that these psychologists tend to discover is the third item that we're talking about, which is levels, or stages, or waves, or whatever we want to talk about. And if you introduce that just on its own, people indeed get very nervous. And rightly so, because it sounds like you're ranking people and judging people and all sorts of horrible things that nobody wants to do. And you clearly have to be careful about that. This is based on very careful sort of research. And on balance, I think it's very healthy because it allows us to gauge our own capacity for increasing care and compassion and consciousness. But it's something you have to deal with very, very carefully and responsibly. And you sort of put the evidence out and let people sort of decide if they're comfortable with it or not. But that is the levels component, so that gives us quadrants, levels, and lines. And that's not the only story. There are whole lots of other things going on. But these are 3 things that we want to include. We'll get to states and types, I assume. But the levels in general, if you kind of look at it, what is very noticeable in all of these scales is that the amount of consciousness increases as you go up these scales. Most of these levels that we're talking about, whether it's in morals or in needs or in values or in self-identity, is an increasing consciousness. It expands and gets more and more and more inclusive. So you can actually think about it as going from sort of subconscious to self-conscious to superconscious, or pre-personal to personal to transpersonal, id to ego to God. It's kind of a progression of wider and wider identification from sort of the very narrowest thing you can identify with to the very broadest thing you can identify with, which is spirit, everything that's arising moment to moment. And that tends to be the way these scales run. That doesn't mean that you have to, in order to have any spiritual realization at all, you have to be the top of these scales. There are all types of spiritual states and realizations that are possible. But just looking at the developmental levels and lines themselves, it does suggest that in any of these lines, the more you develop, in a sense, the more spiritual it becomes. The more consciousness is possible, the more compassion is possible. Even in Carol Gilligan's scale of female moral development, it goes from selfish, which is just me, to care, which is you and me, I care for you, to universal care, I care for all people. And that's a natural growth that she noticed in women. I think there's a lot of truth to that. So that's a very simple view of levels right there, which is going from sort of egocentric to ethnocentric to world-centric. And each of those represents an expansion, a movement, an increasing care and consciousness. That becomes important because at some point, obviously, if we talk about how can I grow, how can I develop, and you look at this evidence here, you're going to say, well, I want more of that superconscious stuff. I want to try to grow and develop in some of these areas to increase my own capacity for awareness and consciousness. And so that's something we also get into as well. It obviously plays into various spiritual approaches and psychotherapy and growth and development.
So just to take things slowly here for a moment, before we really move on from lines, can we put these 24 lines into all 4 of the quadrants? Does that make sense?
You can. And let me also, when we're talking about these developmental lines, right now we're focusing on an individual person, and we're saying what is present in the individual I. The upper left quadrant is where we usually put the I. All of these quadrants have their own developmental lines and levels. So if you look in what we call the upper right quadrant, which means an it, the objective world, a classic developmental sequence there is atoms to molecules to cells to organisms. That's a developmental sequence. That's an evolutionary sequence going from smaller to bigger. And that actually happens. First there are atoms, and then atoms join together into molecules, molecules join together into cells, cells join together into organisms, and so on. So that's an actual developmental line with levels in it. And only it's of its. Those are all objects. They can all be stated in it language. We're talking about them now. They're third persons. We're not talking with them. But on the interior, we're talking about what's going on in an I. And that's when we're talking about values and needs and so on. And so that's the levels and lines in the interior. The lower left is we, or cultures, groups, and they go through their own levels and lines in certain ways. And we can talk about that too. And the lower right, which is its, or systems, ecosystems go through stages. Stellar development goes through stages and so on. So each of the quadrants have levels and lines.
But these 24 or so individual lines, those really apply to development in the upper left.
That's correct.
We're not,
in the
we're
individual
not really,
I. Yes.
In the individual I, we're not really trying to understand how those look in the other 3 quadrants.
Not right now.
Okay.
And ultimately, though, none of these can be separated. That's kind of the interesting thing about the 4 quadrants, or I, we, and it, or the good, the true, and the beautiful, is that they're both different, but they're sort of different aspects of the same thing. You sort of think about it as a mountain with 4 faces to it, or a diamond with different facets to it. The most accurate is a dimension, like height, length, or width. If you have a book, it has length, it has width, and it has height. And none of those can really exist apart from each other. I mean, you never find length without width or height. I mean, it's just, and you don't have width without length and height, but they're different. I mean, I know what that means, and they're different. But they also intertwine. And the 4 quadrants are 4 dimensions of every event. That's why we try to keep I, we, it, and its in mind, because they all kind of go together, even though they're as different as length, height, and width.
Well, this is helpful to me, because I think one of the ways that I've gotten confused in your work has been trying to sort of simul-track whatever's happening in the upper left in the other 3 quadrants, and not finding direct correlations, and thinking that I was sort of losing the effectiveness of the map.
Right.
But what you're saying is that you have to understand each form of measurement on its own terms.
Exactly. And here, let me just give you a really quick example of how there are correlations, but that you don't want to get sort of overly obsessive about them. We're talking about the interior of an eye. And we're saying that there are levels of consciousness from subconscious to self-conscious to superconscious, or there's levels of moral development like Carol Gilligan found from selfish to care to universal care. Now, when a female, let's say, is in the stage of selfish, that's her upper left. In the upper right, there's some brain chemistry that's going on. There's some brain pattern that's going along with that. So there is a correlation. And every state of consciousness has some brain state associated with it. If you're doing Zen Buddhism, you have a Satori, there's a brain state that goes along with that. So there are correlations in all of these, but they're as different as length, height, and width, even though you can't really ultimately separate them. So we're saying a couple of things when we use the quadrants. One is don't try to reduce one to the other, because you can't do that. You can't reduce Satori to brain chemistry. It doesn't work. It has completely different qualities. It looks different. It feels different. At the same time, you can't separate them. Nobody's ever had a Satori without it registering in the brain, ever, as far as we can tell. So we're just trying to say, keep all of these things in mind and don't reduce them to each other. Treat them in their own right. And so the fact that they're different aspects of the same thing, both of those are important. The difference and the sameness. So particularly when we look at the quadrants, we look at the differences, and we're trying to say, okay, this is what you want to pay attention to if you're looking at the interior states and stages of human beings in terms of your own self-understanding, or how, if you want to interact with people and get a better understanding of them. And so these are what these maps of these interiors are about. So right now we're looking at the interior aspects.
Okay, and just a couple more questions about lines. So I could imagine a business executive who says, cognitively, yeah, I'm great, and when it comes to musical skills, right, I'm not so great. But, I don't really care about my musical skills, right, using that example. I mean, right, I've got a lot else going on. I mean, you expect me to be developed in all 24 lines? That's unrealistic, especially if someone might be particularly gifted in a certain area. Right. Then that takes a lot of their attention. They don't have time to develop in all of these other areas. I mean, maybe the goal isn't to develop in all 24 lines.
Yeah, I don't think that's ever the goal. But sort of two parts to that answer. For the particular business executive, yeah, it's okay that you're not good in music. It's okay that you're not good in the culinary line. The Simon Wilber culinary line. I think we're going to introduce that. And we'll go down in history by naming this line after us, although probably neither one of us can cook. And that's
my mother, who was a very good cook, would be glad to hear that this was my contribution to the integral model.
It's okay that the business CEO isn't shining in can't run a 4-minute mile and all those other things. But if you get to a couple of key capacities, like interpersonal capacities, emotional intelligence, and ethics, and they're really low in those, it's gonna catch up with them sooner or later. And so what we try to do, the people that are using integral business management, when they go into a company like this, is they'll actually look at the leaders, the managers, and so on, see where their strengths and weaknesses are. And there's a very simple rule. It's very hard to make an integral person. It's pretty easy to make an integral team. So one of the things that you want to do is have a little self-awareness. You want the CEO to, at the very least, say, okay, you know what? I'm not good at interpersonal stuff. I should stop assuming that I am, because I'm alienating everybody around here. And sooner or later, particularly in today's climate, somebody's going to say, oh, by the way, your ethics is that of a worm. And unless you want to go the way of Enron, you better really, really get your act together here. And if you yourself can't become ethical, you better hire somebody who has the equivalent of universal care level of development, or you are screwed. So they sort of tend to listen to that, if for no other reason, the threat of jail, so to speak. But it's classically their partial, lopsided development that gets them into trouble. This doesn't mean that you can't specialize. Like we're saying, Olympic athletes tend to specialize in one area. It doesn't mean they're going to be very good in other areas. That's okay. What you're looking for to have a kind of an integral, we call it integrally informed orientation, is that I can be integrally informed. Doesn't mean that I have to excel in all 24 of these lines. It does mean, though, that I don't try to deny them, repress them, ignore them, or pretend that they're not there. So it's okay that I might not be well developed in some of these other areas, but what I want to do is be aware of that. And particularly if I'm interacting with people, or particularly if I'm teaching, I have to be aware of where my strengths are and where my weaknesses are. But it doesn't mean that you have to be this sort of the equivalent of a decathlon, Olympic star in all 24 lines. To be integrally informed, it just means be aware that they're there, know what your strengths and weaknesses are. And if you're actually trying to accomplish a goal that requires other capacities that you're not very good at, then you really better look at that. And nowhere does that become more obvious in spiritual teachers, because they tend to really excel in certain lines very well. They have the superconscious level in some of these lines, and they have a subconscious level in some of these other lines, and it gets them in trouble every single time. It's power, food, sex, money. It's any of these things that they haven't given attention to, and they think that just because they're excelling in one line, they're super people in other lines, and usually they're not. And so at the very least, you want them to start making that kind of integrally informed decision based on a more complete map of these possibilities. And that's one of the things we try to do when we work with spiritual teachers, is just give them a little bit of an orientation about where their strengths and weaknesses are, so they can stop inflicting their damaged parts of their psyche on their students as if that's part of the spiritual practice.
Okay, just one final question about lines.
Everybody's going, thank God.
Okay, yeah. I know these lines exist relatively independently from each other, but do some depend on the development of other lines?
Yeah.
And how does that work?
Again, because these are really all kind of intertwined, although some of them obviously are more independent of others. But one of the really important ones is cognitive development. And again, this is something we actually go in and test. What you find, for example, is that cognitive development is necessary but not sufficient for interpersonal development, which is necessary but not sufficient for moral development. A really quick example of that is if we use cognitive development and moral development. Cognitive just means sort of bright, book bright, IQ intelligence, and morals means morals. Now, what it means is that cognitive is necessary but not sufficient for moral development. That means that highly intelligent people might not be very moral, but highly moral people will be intelligent. So we all know a lot of people that are highly intelligent and not very moral. Nazi doctors, I mean, sort of any number of examples that you want. But moral development can't run ahead of cognitive development, because cognitive is your capacity to understand, take different views, see what is, and so on. And that's necessary for moral development to occur. So some people can have high cognitive development and high moral development. But moral development can way, way behind cognitive development. And that's one of the real problems, is usually the people that we think of as really being quite evil are really smart and moral crustaceans. So they're just these, demonic geniuses, the mad scientists kind of thing. And they have just very, very sort of low in these other intelligences, but very, very high in cognitive. But you never find the reverse. You never find an Albert Schweitzer or Martin Luther King who goes very low on cognitive. They're all very intelligent.
Are there any other examples like that of lines that are dependent upon other lines for their development?
Those three are the major ones. Most of the ones like self and values are also dependent upon cognitive. And the reason is cognitive has a little bit of a bad reputation because people mistake it for rational, linear, abstract, and all of that. And it really isn't. It really means your capacity to see what is. So cognition means a cognition of what is, of what's arising. And the person that studied the cognitive line the most was Piaget, and brought a great, great deal of intelligence to that. And even though Piaget's developmental line is now understood to be only one among, a dozen or 24 other lines, his mistake was that he thought it was sort of the only line, and that's kind of what got him in trouble. But for what he did in that line, his research still holds up, is still cross-culturally valid. It's been tested on Aborigines, rainforest Indians. They all go through these stages. It's really interesting. So he was a real genius when it came to that one particular line. And cognitive really means it's just your capacity to perceive what's going on in the objective world. And because that's so primary, then if you take, again, we've been using the example of moral development with Carol Gilligan. So her first stage of selfish, and then a next stage of care, and then universal care. Those three stages each depend upon a higher cognitive capacity. That's why you can't get to universal care or universal compassion without being at Piaget's highest stage of development, which is formal operational. And the reason is only there can you take third-person perspectives. So if cognitively you can't do that, you can't have universal compassion. You can't see the other person's point of view. So because cognitive development is necessary but not sufficient for moral development, then you can be very high cognitive, very low moral, but not vice versa. You never find somebody at the universal care stage who's still at a very low stage of cognitive development. And that's true for values as well. And again, it's because cognitive provides the raw material that morals and values will work on. And without that raw material, you can't go any higher than that line.
Okay, I'm satisfied now.
Okay.
So we've got the quadrants. We've got the lines. And
Okay.
now we're really going to move on, Ken. This concludes Session 1 of Cosmic Consciousness with Ken Wilber. Our program continues with Session 2.